I love time traveling. It's a concept that I like to occasionally think about, and I've watched a lot of TV shows and movies based around it. Some of my favorite first-person shooters are based on time traveling as well, and honestly, I think time traveling is one of the most unique concepts that you can apply to many different things. Trapped in a different universe, time traveling. Wanna solve an old mystery, time traveling. Somehow, you're stuck in a place and you're repeating the same day, there has to be a solution to it. The point is, more often than not, there's always some kind of logic behind time traveling stories. And it's up to the audience to figure out where the pieces line up. Which is why I feel like the idea that I'm about to mention is one that may have crossed some people's mind, but it's more than likely nobody ever realized that it could be a cool idea. Alright, so, do you feel like that replaying single player games feels like time traveling? Let's break down one of the most common stories in time traveling. I went back in time to fix a problem and now I feel like I've caused a new problem. This concept shows up in Back to the Future, it shows up in 11/22/63, and if you apply it to single player games, it's basically just looking up a guide or repeating a quest until we get the desired ending that we want from it. This, however, is unavoidable, because the more time we spend on a game we enjoy, the more we get to know that game, and even if we take time off from it, once we go back to it to replay it, we always have a bit of a different perspective approaching that game. Of course, in many cases we cannot change the ending because it's not written in as an option, and certain choices are debatable if it ever makes any sense, or if it is subjective, if it's a better or worse ending. So how about if we apply this logic to games that have no story? What if we apply this logic to racing games? I feel like we had a game that never realized that it could be a time-traveling racing game. F1 12 is a racing game that's based around the 2012 Formula 1 World Championship. In it you can drive as a driver for many of the teams, and it has some extra game modes included. The game has a few scenarios, which all are somewhat based on real-life events. For example, are you staying out on the wrong tire set or going into the pits to beat your rival? The champion mode of the game ends with you racing against the 7 world champions that were on the grid in 2012. While the mode itself is nothing more than that, I feel like there's an untapped potential here, because a few years later we got a fully dynamic career mode that lets you either pick one of the teams to race at or build your own car and be the 11th team, and you can play through this game for multiple seasons with different car upgrades, rule changes, driver transfers, and even custom schedules. So my question is, what would happen if we applied this same structure but put it in the 1970s? Have a career mode where you start out in the 1970s in someone's shoes. The game would build you up based on your driving standards to have a strength, an aggression, a driving style. And then if you feel like it, later down the line, you could go back to that time period that you built up with that driver, but in someone else's shoes. Create different timelines based on how you alter the race history, or bring newer drivers into older era. I understand that this might sound gimmicky, and as I said, this is just an idea that occasionally goes inside my head. But ever since I've seen Raceovic's video about how there's no creativity in recent racing games, and everything is just pretty much the same thing told over and over, we are playing the same game, the same content, and often cannot tell the difference between 2 or 3 titles. The idea that I gave with F1 will most likely never happen, and there are multiple factors for it. Currently, the F1 series is the only one that I can think of that has this deep progression system with its campaign mode. And while there have been changes over the years with it, it's pretty much the same thing, outside of those minor changes. And that's partially thanks to the series being a yearly release as a sports title. Outside of F1, however, there are not many dedicated racing games for a sport. And once you remove that and try to do something casual, it's gonna be a hard sell. Fictional stories are not written well these days for racing games. And even the ones that are decent, there are always a catch about the games themselves. So when you combine this really obscure story idea and think how it could be actually executed, you really end up with just a sandbox game. And by that point, why make a new game when it's already available for many of the current titles? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars to race on hundreds and hundreds of racetracks across multiple different simulators or arcade racers. I think the idea would be interesting, at least, as many of the videos that I see about sim racing are about recreating a vibe of a certain era, drive as someone else, race for a certain team, create your own story. So who knows, maybe one day we will see a game like this. I would be first to buy it, that's for sure.